Question. Are diseases, accidents, or destructive weather patterns a breakdown of order or a consequence of order? Now, I would say they're both, right, in different respects. So they're a breakdown of the order in the one who has them. Right? So a disease is clearly the breakdown of the order of health. But it's the consequence of other orders, there's no doubt. So, for example, the disease is caused by a very purposeful activity of whatever the virus or whatever is causing it. And so the disease is both a breakdown of one order and the purposeful effect of another order. And so this simply goes to show that things like disease can't be taken as arguments against an orderer, an ultimate orderer of the world, right? And people often make that argument. No, they say there can't be a divine orderer of the world because there are things like cancer or other disorders. And it's true they're disorders from one point of view, but they're also marvelous orders in their own right, although not favorable to us. And so that doesn't argue against the divine order, but this is a matter for another talk. But this marvelous orderer, God, has so designed the world that he wants all different levels of good. And he wants the level of good of the virus as well as the level of good of us. He wants the level of good of the mosquito as well as the level of good of the one bitten by the mosquito. And each one in its place and order. And there's also another providential reason for that has something to do with original sin.
So in a cancer, where you're not talking about, let's say, a separate organism, but a runaway cell.
Right, it's a breakdown of order, clearly.
Where is the order in that? Is the fact that the cell is replicating according to some...
Right. There's still some marvelous order taking place, even though looked at more globally, it's a breakdown. We would need a whole other talk, and hopefully we will have it later on, to talk about the objection of the problem of evil. Because this is one instance, and what we'll see is that evil is a parasite. Evil lives on good. There cannot be a pure evil, an evil without a good subject. Everywhere you find evil in a good subject. And the more terrible the evil, what are you going to find? The better the subject. That's what makes the evil more terrible. So of all the evils that we know, there's one that stands out: Satan. What makes that evil so terrible? The excellence of the subject. Because that's an evil in an angel, created good by God with this magnificent nature and a marvelous will. And so when that marvelous nature goes awry, through the very power and beauty of that nature, in other words, the very glory of this magnificent creation, free will, out of all of God's creations, free will is the most magnificent because it makes the creature most like unto God. And so when that magnificent creation goes awry, the evil is greater. But it's a parasitical evil. It's an evil that requires the excellent subject. And the same thing is true in all human evil. Right? That's why the corruption of the best is what's worst. And again, this doesn't argue against the orderer. It argues precisely to the intelligence of the order who creates such a marvelous good as free will. But it's the very nature of that free will that it can result in moral evil, which is the greatest of all evils.
But isn't the lack of order, the way I see it, maybe our way to true holiness too?
The lack of order? The way to true holiness?
The disease.
Yes, exactly. And that's another...
Some people say cancer, it's a lack of order.
Right.
Disorderly cellular growth.
Right.
But that may be the way through to our own holiness.
Exactly.
And closeness to
right.
God.
Fantastic. And so this is a beautiful, again, argument for the wisdom of the orderer. That orderer is so wise that things that in and of themselves are disorders, he permits only to bring about some much more marvelous order of a different kind, that couldn't exist without that lower disorder. In other words, out of this physical disorder of the cancer, he makes possible the marvel of patience, of a moral good that's incommensurable with the physical evil. Excellent. And so just in general, we can say that all the breakdowns of order are still pointing to the order and helping us in some sense, because again, our eye gets dulled, and so we get too accustomed to seeing the order, and we don't marvel. And so we actually need the breakdowns of the order to appreciate the order. And that's because of our weakness. And God provides for that weakness by allowing that breakdown so that we can come to appreciate. And this is true on so many levels in so many ways. Think even simply the history of the church. The doctrine of the church, the teaching of the church develops when? When people fall into heresy. When people deny those truths of faith and question them and reject them. Right? That forces us to come to the defense, to appreciate, to ponder that order. Now, it would be better if we just pondered it just for its own sake, like Our Lady. But we need the breakdown of the order so often to help us to see the orderer. Right? And so, generally, conversion stories, there's some encounter with evil in its various forms. That is precisely what makes you inquire, to search for the okay. So is man not wholly good, beautiful by nature, but we just participate in God's beauty, goodness, etc.? By grace? But then didn't God say creation was very good? Yes, I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but let me... So, I said in the talk that the various levels of goodness are all participating in goodness. But aren't goodness with a capital G by nature. It's true, we're good. So everything that God made in its different level, the different participations are all good. But it's one thing to say that the participation is good with the small g, and it's another thing to say that the participation is the goodness. Is the good. Right? So no creature is the good. But the creature is good, precisely because it participates. And in fact, every creature is good by nature, because its nature is a certain participation of what God is. Right? And so we see that so marvelously said in Genesis 1. Right? Each level of the creation, again, that's Genesis chapter 1 gives us those tiers of the hierarchy. No, why 6 days of creation? Because God created hierarchically. And the higher things are last in that hierarchy. And so at each level it is good, and then at the 6th day, very good. Right? Again, the levels of... Great. Another question. It sounds like intelligent order completely negates the possibility of evolution. Is this so? Great question. No. Right, so the answer, no. Depending, though, on how one understands evolution. Very often the word evolution, so I think in the ordinary understanding of evolution, no. If by ordinary evolution we simply mean a progression in which something becomes more ordered over time. That's what Genesis 1 shows us that, right? So Genesis 1, the 6 days, show us that in this work of God's creation, there was an evolution such that the work of the 6th day builds on the work of the other days and makes possible a perfection that couldn't be without the earlier day's work on which it's built, right? So on the 6th day, you can't have man without all those other things that happen first, right? So we can speak of Revelation as speaking about a certain kind of evolution, if by evolution we mean a progression from a simpler, less ordered to a higher, more ordered stage. Right, so clearly that's compatible with Revelation because that's in Genesis 1. But if by evolution one means that progression happened without an orderer, then no, right? So that's how the trick. It seems to me to avoiding useless conflicts is to situate yourself at a sufficient height. But by height, I mean so often fruitless conflicts come from people talking past each other because one's descending too much into detail. And so the secret is to put yourself at a sufficient, on a level of principle. And here the level of principle is the orderer can so orchestrate his creation such that lower things make possible higher things and serve as building blocks for those higher things. And that will be a more marvelous order. And it'll be still more marvelous if, to the extent that he allows the lower things to be real causes making possible higher things or leading to higher things. But it's all coming ultimately from the orderer. So a theory like Darwin's, if it simply is saying that natural selection and in other words, a variety that's made possible by sexual reproduction and mutation, and then a survival of the fittest will lead to selection. There's nothing in that contrary to what we've set forth as the fifth way, an orderer, because the orderer would have set forth those conditions in which the creature can really participate in leading to a higher in other words, God has so ordered the world that things can have a real causal effect on leading to other things. And that just would simply be a more marvelous world. Now, I do think, though, that there's a limit. But it's not relevant to our proof of God's existence. Right? I think that's really important to separate the problems. In other words, this argument for God's existence simply comes from we see this marvelous order, and if there's a Darwinian kind of evolution happening, the order would simply be more marvelous, not less marvelous, and therefore would point to God. So in either way we have it, whether there's Darwinian evolution or not, we still got the orderer. Now I do think that there is a problem in the way that the Darwinian evolution is normally framed, and that is that I think it's assumed that you simply can go blindly from the less to the more. And that runs into all kinds of problems that are also of a scientific nature and a mathematical nature. In other words, it seems that you have a huge problem with regard to probabilities if you subtract the orderer. But you put the orderer back into the picture and there's no problem. Because suppose we say that it's incredibly improbable that simply by natural variation you're going to come out with a natural variation resulting in an eye. All right, I'm oversimplifying the case. Or whatever, the flagellum of the one-celled creature. Right? That's not going to just... It's too unlikely, it would seem, that would happen in the ordinary course of things. All right. But again, if you have a designer and intelligence orchestrating the whole thing, well, he can orchestrate it such that the improbable will occur. That's precisely the evidence of design. In other words, we think that there's a designer whenever what would be incredibly improbable without a designer occurs. So as we look at the cathedral, all right, I think it's pretty improbable that those mosaics would just come out with those magnificent images if they're by themselves, right, without an intelligence designing it. And so the very improbability of an outcome, if it was left to blind forces, that shows us the designer.
In the participation good argument, is it safe to assume that this argument doesn't vary or stray too far from the Platonic sort of forms? Is it only the inherent limitations or lack of inherent limitations isn't something as the good that separates this from essentially Plato's argument?
Excellent. Okay. So is the fourth way equivalent to Plato's argument, basically? So I would say, and not exactly, but that's a really good question. Plato's philosophy is built on something very similar. The idea that which participates has to have its source in the unparticipated. And thus, for that reason, he posited that there are these archetypes, ideas, the good, the man, the horse, now that's where it gets weird, that are the causes of those things that participate, individual men, individual horses, all good things. And so clearly there's some, but I think he's speaking above. So the best way to make sense of Plato's argument is a different kind of causality that we're talking about here. The causality of, let's go back to Michelangelo. If Michelangelo's making a statue, there's got to be an idea of the statue in the artist's mind first. That's the best way to understand, I think, Plato's ideas. Whereas here, in other words, they would be the blueprint in the mind of the creator. And so it really goes more with the fifth way. In other words, this orderer has to have an idea of that order that he's creating that pre-exists. Whereas in the fourth way, we're saying that this participation implies that it's also its efficient cause has to be
It's thrust into being at all, not
right.
necessarily just its temporal.
Right, that's right. Great. Right, and of course the difficulty with Plato's theory is that if you look at it any other way, then, I mean, there is a first man that's the cause of all men. That's man in God's mind, right? But there isn't a first man in any other sense. Well, I guess there is Christ, but again, it's the same idea. He's the exemplar. We talked about that in the typology series, right? Christ is the type of every creature. Is it the beauty of God that would kill us if we looked at Him now, because it is so far from our intelligence? Right, because Scripture says in many places that the creature can't see the Creator and live. Obviously, that's our hope, that we'll see God face to face. But first, we have to be transformed. We have to be given a new light. We have to be made like unto Him before we can see Him as He is. St. John says, we shall see Him as He is, for we shall be like unto Him. And so without that likeness, the creature can't see everything is received according to the mode of the receiver. And so our mode has to be radically transformed so that we can receive God. And we can't do that. He has to do it. But yes, that beauty would kill us in the sense we can't take it in without being transformed into His likeness supernaturally in the light of glory. Right? Here's a question. So I was talking about conscience and natural law being written on our heart. Well, what about, say, the terrorist and the suicide bomber? How is that compatible with the law being written on our heart? And we could say more in general, how can we say that there is a law of conscience that's universally imprinted on every rational being's heart if we see such abominations as, I don't know, Stalin's prison camps or Hitler's Holocaust? And so what do we answer to that? The law written on the heart is in fact indelible. Right? The worst sinner, even Satan, even Hitler, Stalin, can't entirely eliminate it. No, and we can see that in the very attempt to stamp it out. The best image of this, I think, is in Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, who, after shedding so much blood, having her husband shed that blood, she starts to see blood everywhere, no, and tries to stamp out that blood that she sees out a damn spot, and cannot. No, and it consumes her. And so this is what life shows us, is that the more a person sins, the more, in some sense, they attempt to stamp out the very law. And it's precisely that leads to the hatred of God, because of His justice. And so the very fact that when we violate the law, we begin to wage war on the lawmaker, that shows us something, right? That shows us that the law is there, that we didn't make it, and that we can't wipe it out. So even the worst thing, right, the very worst thing in all of creation, that kind of evil in waging war on God, even that shows us the continued existence of the law written on the heart. And then it's much easier to see that in lower cases. It's just that, so take a gang of robbers who spends their whole life robbing. What happens if you steal from the common fund of the robber gang? Right? If one of the gang steals from his neighbor. Indignation, but an indignation that is justice violated. And again, it shows no matter how much one violates the law, it can't be removed. Because if someone else acts against that law in me, the law is very vigorous. And we could go on and on. And just again, the terrorist does it only because he's not thinking that those people that he's blowing up are somebody's mother and baby. And could be his. But if he did think that, he wouldn't do it. No. And this is why those suicide bombers, apparently, from what little I know, before they go on their missions, what do? Try not to think. And so they go to the nightclub, they get drugs or drunk, so that they don't think about what they're about to do. Because if they were to think about it, they might not do it. And that just simply shows that the law can't be eradicated any more than the law in inanimate things can be eradicated. We can make its voice more feeble, right? But we can't kill it.
So different than the martyrs, the Christian martyrs, went to their death capitalized.
Right.
But these terrorists also have the spiritual, motivation. They think they're doing the will of God.
That's true. And again, it shows that evil is a parasite, right? It has to rely on something good.
But that they have to, anesthetize themselves to do it.
Right. In other words, it shows us that they're acting against conscience rather than acting in accordance. So it's a mistake to think that when somebody does evil like that, they're acting in accordance with their conscience. Right? It's not so, and you can see it's not so, precisely because they're working hard to deaden its voice. Okay. Is going to the zoo a theological or philosophical event? Yes! Fantastic! I have to thank Marcia for this, though. She's the one who always tries to get me to go to the zoo for its philosophical and theological eventness. But sure, because the zoo shows us hierarchy. Right? And that hierarchy is a little image of the more marvelous hierarchy that is in the spiritual world and in the church. And so every level of creation has its own hierarchy. And the higher hierarchies are more marvelous, but they're less visible. And so the zoo is a magnificent, what should we call it, exhibit, for seeing in this hierarchy in a sensible level. Right, in heaven, when we see the Last Judgment, we'll see all the levels of the saints. Now, here below, that may bother us, because there can be those higher, and we'll think that we might feel envious. But in heaven, it won't be that way. We'll marvel in the different participations, each one distinct, each one, and all mutually enriching, because that's God's plan in creation. His plan in creation is to have all the levels. It's so much better to have a world, apparently, it's the one God picked, in which you get the zoo, than a world in which you just get pink herons. I mean, right? Any one thing, no matter whatever animal you love, if the whole zoo was that, it would be boring, right? We would be missing all the other levels, and we wouldn't even appreciate that level, because its beauty is really its complementarity with the other levels. Now, if that's true in the zoo, how much more true it's going to be in heaven. Right? In heaven, when we see all the different kinds of sanctity, all the different saints, each one with different gifts that the others don't have, and vice versa, that is what will be so beautiful. In other words, the inequality always goes together with complementarity. And it's and thus so this is one of the key ideas of Saint Teresa's Story of a Soul, Saint Teresa's book of her own life. Right? That's how she starts. That was her key insight that God gave her. So right at the beginning of it, she speaks about in a garden, if everything was a rose or a lily, and there wasn't that wild violet, the wildflowers, it wouldn't be as beautiful, even though the rose is more magnificent than the wildflower. And so the wildflower is a really important thing in God's plan. Yeah. And the whole, in other words, precisely the hierarchy makes possible this marvelous complementarity, because no creature is such that he can perfectly imitate God, that he can be a perfect manifestation of the glory of God. And so it's much better that there be all the levels of participation, because all the levels in one level will have something that the higher level is lacking. Right? So even though one is lower than another, nevertheless, the lower one's got something better than the higher one. All right, maybe we don't have anything better than Our Lady. But take even angels are a higher level of being. But angels can't participate in reproduction. Angels can't have family. Angels can't participate in spousal self-giving in the way that we can. And so their very higher nature makes possible that they manifest God in some ways better than we can, but not in others. And so again, the hierarchy also makes possible this magnificent complementarity. And that's what you see in the zoo, right? That you need the different kinds of things, and they form together this magnificent system, kingdom. So yes, I think zoo is a theological, philosophical event. Thanks to Marcia, who brings me there. But not often enough. Is the argument for order does that show that disorder is an evil? Well, evil is the lack of something where it ought to be. So disorder, simply in itself, the lack of order, isn't an evil. What's an evil is the lack of order where there ought to be order. And that's the that shows that the worst evil is the lack of order where there ought to be the most order. Where ought there to be the most order? In human acts, the acts of a free rational creature. Because it's a rational creature. We said before, when we find an order, that leads us to the intelligence. All right, we've got an intelligence. Therefore, the acts that we produce through intelligence, they ought to be the most ordered acts. And therefore, if they're not, then there's the greatest evil. And when are our acts not ordered? When they're not ordered to God. Right? In other words, our acts are rightly ordered when, through a whole chain, they end up in God. And they're not ordered when they can't be ordered to God. And thus, that's the worst evil in the world.
If for instance, there wasn't another creature, as humans being the only creatures to recognize order, if there were no other creatures to recognize order, how would God be recognized as ours?
Well, that's why He made rational creatures, right? And it seems, it wouldn't have been fitting for God to make a world without any rational creatures. And so we don't think that God would have done that, although He's certainly absolutely free to do that. But it would seem that it would be missing part of the point, right? That He makes so that His glory be manifested. And all other things are things that manifest His glory, but the rational creature alone, one that recognizes that glory manifested by the others and can praise the orderer. Right? And again, that's why this process that we're doing tonight, that's why it's important for human beings, independently of any benefit that we get. Which is another question here. Scientific knowledge of natural processes helps us to live better. Well, what does this hypothesis of intelligent design, or the fifth way, help us to do? Right? Well, it's true that philosophy, and above all, this kind of philosophy, metaphysics, is the least useful of all things if one's talking about the making means to an end. So engineering is a lot more useful. Medicine is a lot more useful than metaphysics. And so this is what Aristotle says in his Metaphysics. This is, of all things, metaphysics is the least useful in itself. Why? Because it's concerned with the end. Metaphysics, what we're doing tonight is contemplating the end of human life. What's the end of human life is God, and God's order, and God's beauty, and God's truth. And so in doing what we're doing the least useful, because useful things are means to get to an end. But in doing this, we're anticipating a little bit. I mean, obviously, this is a very bad approximation of our more perfect contemplation in the beatific vision. But nevertheless, this kind of contemplation is the kind of thing that we're going to be doing for eternity. And therefore, it's what we're for. Just unfortunately, we can't do this all the time because we have to eat and sleep and all those other things. One last question. This is much too difficult. Now, I said in the talk that all of these grades that we see are like receivers. And that all the different receivers, they point to one who's not a receiver, but is a giver. But yet, can't God receive something from us? Our love? So that's the question. Our son is actually doing his doctoral thesis on this, Francis. So I could dodge it and say, ask him. But I'll. I think I would say it like this. We said the fourth way tells us that every perfect thing we find in creation has to have its infinite source in God. Well, reception of the gift of self of another, isn't that a rather perfect thing? In fact, of all the things, that's one of the most perfect. In other words, of all things that we encounter, the most perfect are the making of a self-gift to another and the receiving of another self-gift. Because that's a kind of self-gift, to receive another self-gift. And if that's a great thing in a creature, well, it must be there in God if it doesn't imply any limitation. And so that would be the question here. Does it imply any limitation to receive the self-gift of another? And I think, no, certainly not. It only would be a limitation if that self-gift of another makes me grow. All right, we're not going to make God grow by giving him our hearts. So in that sense, he can't receive it so as to grow. But to receive another self-gift doesn't mean that, right? It means I think it's a pure perfection. It's a perfection that doesn't imply any limitation. And so, yes, God is the infinite receiver of hearts because he's God. So that's how I would answer that. But there's much, much more to be said about that. And on that note, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, we give thee thanks, Almighty God, for these and all thy gifts, thou who livest, reignest, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving.